So what does the CR do about the existential threat of climate change? It does not even specify funding levels within the Environmental Protection Agency. In other words, the administration could simply eliminate funding for climate change and environmental justice, and that would be consistent with this CR. And on top of all of this, the administration is already indicating that they will simply ignore the provisions of the spending bill they don't like. This week, it was reported that Vice President J.D. Vance said to the Senate Republican caucus, quote, "I want everyone to vote yes. The President under Section 2 will ensure allocations from Congress are not spent on things that harm the taxpayer." There's so much grift in Washington. Let's move the CR, get to reconciliation, and for Congress to pass appropriations. End of quote. In other words, what Vance is saying is, don't worry about what's actually in the bill. The Trump administration doesn't like it. They won't do it. And let's be clear. The House CR that was passed in an extremely partisan vote, I think they won by 3 or 4 votes, 1 Democrat out of 215 voted for it. The House CR and the Trump administration are doing everything they can to lay the groundwork for more tax breaks for billionaires, paid for by massive cuts to Medicaid, nutrition assistance, housing, and education. So you're looking at a 1-2 punch, a very bad CR, and then a reconciliation bill coming down, which will be the final kick in the teeth for the American people. This legislation that the Republicans are working on, the reconciliation bill, would cut taxes for billionaires in the top 1% by over $1.1 trillion over the next decade. According to a recent study, if all of Trump's so-called America First policies are enacted, the bottom 95% of Americans will see their taxes go up, while the richest 5% will see their taxes go down, way down. I should also mention that that reconciliation bill, which Republicans are working on right now, would also cut Medicaid by $880 billion. Tax breaks for billionaires, throwing low-income kids off of health care, decimating nursing homes all over America because nursing homes receive 2/3 of their funding from Medicaid, making it harder for community health centers to survive, who provide health care to 32 million Americans, because 43% of their revenue comes from Medicaid. Cut Medicaid by $880 billion. You will significantly deteriorate the quality of health care all over America at a time when the system is already broken. Further, the reconciliation bill proposes to cut at least $230 billion from nutrition. Today, nearly 1 out of 5 kids in America rely on federal nutrition programs to keep them from going hungry. And I find it rather remarkable that the richest person on earth, somebody worth hundreds of billions of dollars, that he and his other oligarch friends are working night and day to cut programs for the working people of this country and to actually deny food to hungry kids in America. There is no world, no universe, no religion that would not believe that that is grossly immoral and unacceptable. You don't give tax breaks to the rich and take food away from hungry children. Mr. President, the House CR bill that we will be soon voting on here is a piece of legislation I cannot support. Instead, what the Senate must do is pass a 30-day CR so that all members of Congress, not just the House Republican leadership, can come together and produce a good piece of legislation that works for all Americans and not just the few. We have an opportunity now to serve the American people. We have an opportunity to write something that reflects what people in the Congress feel, what the people in America feel. Now, I go around the country, and just a couple of weeks ago, I held a telephone town hall in Vermont. We are a small state, Mr. President. We only have about 650,000 people. And yet on that telephone town hall, there was some 34,000 people listening in. It is a significant percentage of a small state. I have been in many parts of the country recently. I've been in Iowa. I have been in Wisconsin. I have been in Nebraska. I've been in Michigan. And what I can tell you with absolute certainty is whether people are conservative, whether they're Republican, whether they're progressive, whether they're moderate, independent, whatever they may be, there are very few people in this country who think we should give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the rich and cut back on Medicaid, education, and nutritional programs for hungry children. So, Mr. President, what I strongly propose is that we pass a 30-day CR, that we do what has always been the case here in the Senate, have both parties work together to come up with a good piece of legislation. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Ohio.
I ask that the previously scheduled roll call vote be scheduled immediately.
Without objection,
Question occurs on the nomination.
the question occurs on the nomination.
Ayes? Thank you.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Harona, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lemus, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slapkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Mr. Padilla. Oops. I have it. Senators voting in the affirmative: Britt, Budd, Husted, Marino, and Scott of Florida. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Durbin, Padilla, Warren, and Whitehouse. Ms. Hassan? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Schatz, no. You did. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Warnock. No. Ms. Rosen. No. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. King, no.
Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Brooks, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Schumer, no.
The yeas are 54, the nays are 45, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and
With respect to the motion to invoke cloture on S331.
is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on calendar number 18, S331, a bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is the sense of the Senate that the debate on S331, a bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act with respect to the scheduling of fentanyl-related substances and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fetterman, Fisher, Gallego, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hovind, Husted, Hydesmith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Kim, King, Langford, McConnell, McCormick, Murray, Ricketts, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Smith, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Hirono, Markey, Sanders, Schiff. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. No. Mrs. Moody, aye. What- Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye.
The yeas are 84, the nays are 15. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the bill.
Counter number 18, S331, a bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act with respect to the scheduling of fentanyl-related substances and for other purposes.
Chair will recognize the Democratic leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, over the last 2 months, the United States has confronted a very bitter truth. The federal government has been taken over by a nihilist. Donald Trump, in 2 months, has taken a blowtorch to our country and wielded chaos like a weapon. Republicans in Congress, meanwhile, have caved to his every whim. The grand old party has devolved into a crowd of Trump sycophants and MAGA radicals who want to burn everything to the ground. Look no further than what DOJ is doing. Now Republicans' nihilism has brought us to the brink of disaster. Unless Congress acts, the federal government will shut down tomorrow at midnight. I have said many times there are no winners in a government shutdown. But there are certainly victims, the most vulnerable Americans, who rely on federal programs to feed their families, to access medical care, and to stay financially afloat. Communities that depend on government services to function will suffer, and suffer greatly. This week, Democrats offered a sensible way out. Fund the government for another month to give appropriators more time to do their jobs. Republicans rejected this proposal outright. Why did they reject it? Because Donald Trump doesn't want the appropriators to do their job. He wants full control over government spending. He isn't the first president to want this, but he's the first president to cower his party into submission, so that Republican rejection leads us to a decision. That Republican rejection leads us to a decision. And it's not really a decision, it's a Hobson's choice. Either proceed with the bill before us or risk Donald Trump throwing America into the chaos of a shutdown. This, in my view, is no choice at all. While the CR bill is very bad, the potential for a shutdown has consequences for America that are much, much worse. For sure, the Republican bill is a terrible option. It is not a clean CR. It is deeply partisan. It doesn't address far too many of this country's needs. But I believe allowing Donald Trump to take even much more power via a government shutdown is a far worse option. And before I explain why, let me be clear about one thing. No one on my side of the aisle wants a government shutdown. Members who support this CR do not want a government shutdown. Members who oppose this CR do not want a government shutdown. Members who oppose this CR want the Republicans to take their responsibilities more seriously and to negotiate spending bills that will address the many needs of the American people. I respect them for that. Unfortunately, though, this Republican Party is the party of Trump. As bad as passing the CR is, as I said, allowing Donald Trump to take even much more power via a government shutdown is a far worse option. First, a shutdown would give Donald Trump and Elon Musk carte blanche to destroy vital government services at a significantly faster rate than they can right now. Under a shutdown, the Trump administration would have full authority to deem whole agencies, programs, and personnel non-essential, furloughing staff with no promise they would ever be rehired. The decision on what is essential would be solely left to the executive branch, with nobody left at the agencies to check them. In short, a shutdown would give Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Doge, and vote, the keys to the city, state, and country. A shutdown would give Donald Trump the keys to the city, the state, and the country. And don't take my word for it. Musk has said aloud he wants a shutdown, and public reporting has shown he is already making plans to use the shutdown to expedite his destruction of key government programs and services. Musk told reporters, if the job is not essential or they are not doing it well, they obviously shouldn't be on the public payroll. Many federal employees and government experts are rightly worried that a temporary shutdown could lead to permanent cuts. Second, if we enter a shutdown, congressional Republicans would weaponize their majorities to cherry-pick which parts of the government to reopen. In a protracted shutdown, House and Senate Republicans would pursue a strategy of bills to the floor and pursue a strategy of bringing bills to the floor to reopen only their favorite departments and agencies, while leaving other vital services that they don't like to languish. Third, the shutdown is not a political game. Shutdown means real pain for American families. For example, veteran services. I believe a shutdown could cause regional VA offices to reduce staff, delay benefit processing, and curtail mental health services, abandoning veterans who earned and depended on those resources. Social Security and seniors. I believe a shutdown could greenlight Trump to slash administrative staff at Social Security offices, delaying new applications, benefit adjustments, and forcing seniors to wait even longer for the benefits they've earned. Justice and courts. Extremely troubling, I believe. A shutdown could stall federal court cases, one of the best redoubts against Trump's lawlessness. It could require to furlough critical staff at the courts, denying victims and defendants alike their day in court, dragging out appeals, and clogging the justice system for months or even years. This administration has shown an unfathomable willingness to sacrifice American families and their well-being to advance their own political agenda. A shutdown positions them to do this on overdrive. Finally, there is one more reason I oppose a shutdown. President Trump and Republican leaders would like nothing more than to pull us into the mud of a protracted government shutdown. For Donald Trump, a shutdown would be a gift. It would be the best distraction he could ask for from his awful agenda. Right now, Donald Trump owns the chaos in the government. He owns the chaos in the stock market. He owns the damage happening to our economy from one end of the country to the other. The stock market is crashing. Consumer confidence is plummeting. Donald Trump is hoping for a shutdown because it will distract from his true agenda, delivering massive cuts to the rich, paid for on the backs of American families. He wants to gut Social Security, hollow out Medicaid, slap taxes on consumer goods through his reckless trade wars. In a shutdown, we would be busy fighting with Republicans over which agencies to reopen, which to keep closed, instead of debating the damage Donald Trump's agenda is causing the American people. Mr. President, I believe it is my job to make the best choice for the country to minimize the harms to the American people. Therefore, I will vote to keep the government open and not shut it down. There is nobody in the world, nobody, who wants to shut the government down more than Donald Trump and more than Elon Musk. We should not give it to them. And make no mistake, Democrats will continue to fight what Donald Trump is doing. Everything that Trump, Musk, and Republicans have done so far has a clear goal. Again, cutting taxes for billionaires, eviscerate Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. This is the fight that matters most, and the fight we must focus on. All the chaos we have seen, all the lawlessness, all the grift and corrupt behavior. It's all about rigging the system in favor of the ultra-wealthy at the expense of working Americans. This is the fight the American people need to see. This is the fight that Democrats will win. A shutdown will be a costly distraction from this all-important fight. I yield the floor.
Chair recognizes the senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, today I rise to celebrate the birthday of someone very special. My grandmother, Lyra Baker Boyd, who I call Mama. Today, she turns 100 years old. She's such an incredible woman. I think about the memories over my lifetime. I think about the impact she's had on me and my cousins, on people all around her who have the honor of knowing her. Some of my earliest memories are that of her kindness and gentleness, her teaching me how to treat others. I remember sitting at her kitchen table as my grandfather was going over different Bible verses before church on Sunday morning. She'd make oatmeal. We'd get blueberries out of her garden. She'd make scrambled eggs, pouring milk in them to make them go a little bit further. Making sure we used our best manners at the table, and then sending us off to conquer the day. There's no doubt she had a passion for leaving everyone and every place that she encountered better as a result of her. Those values that she has, those values of service, they started so early in her life. Mama graduated high school at the height of the Second World War. and she dreamed of serving our country overseas. As we know, women weren't allowed to enlist in combat roles at that time. So she embarked on a different pathway to serve. She became a nurse. It was 1943 when she enrolled at what was then the Hillman Hospital School of Nursing. It later became Jefferson Hillman, and it is now right at the center of the University of Alabama at Birmingham's medical campus. Mama was ready to ship out to Europe to tend to our wounded soldiers, but V-Day actually came right before she graduated. So, still wanting to serve her fellow Americans in some way, she moved to Enterprise, Alabama. I'm proud to call that my hometown. And she began her 40-year nursing career. In the early 50s, during the Korean War, her husband, my papa, as I call him, was among the brave soldiers defending our ally from communist invasion. Mama and her sisters moved to Seattle during the time. She moved to live with her sister there, and she worked as a registered nurse. During her time in the Pacific Northwest, she never lost her Southern roots. Her colleagues even called her Magnolia. They said it was clear that she held Alabama dear. Ultimately, she and Papa made their way back down to the Yellowhammer State as Mama worked as a labor and delivery nurse until she retired. Both she and Papa's life are emblematic of their generation, rooted in unselfishness, unselfish service to our great country. They personified what JFK said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Mama helped teach that to my entire family. She wanted us to know that life wasn't always about us. She makes sure in every conversation that we understand that there is a greater purpose and a higher calling to which we must answer, and in service to which we must all work. We all have a responsibility to put our God, our family, our friends, and our country above our own personal interest, and there is nobody who embodies that better than my grandmother. That service to our communities and our nation can take many shapes and forms. For both of my grandfathers, it was military service. For others in my family, it has been protecting their fellow Americans as law enforcement officers or firefighters. For me, it is the honor to stand and serve in this body. And for Mama, it was helping bring life into this world, helping new moms, and nursing people back from sickness. Above all, what Mama has taught me is that you must use your post, whatever it is in life, to make a difference in the lives around you. We are all called to serve. We're all called to be in the arena. Everyone's service is different, but no one's is less important. It's about striving to do better, to be better, and to leave this world better than we found it. So thank you, Mama, for being a guiding light throughout the course of my life. On behalf of my aunts and uncles, cousins, and Mama's families and friends, we say happy 100th birthday. We love you dearly, Mama. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Chair recognizes the senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, this is a theme that I've been speaking of, which affects states across the nation, which is the National Flood Insurance Program and the threat that it might lapse and the inability of families to be able to afford. Why are flood insurance premiums so high, you might ask? Flood insurance premiums have skyrocketed across the country due to FEMA's new risk assessment system, Risk Rating 2.0. At the heart of the problem with Risk Rating 2.0 is that with much higher premiums, people will quickly be unable to afford coverage and just drop their policies. It's well known in the insurance actuarial world that when you increase a policy by a certain percent, there's going to be another percent of people who just drop their coverage. And that means that the pool of policyholders shrinks and the program enters into what is called actuarial death spiral, which is to say that the risk, instead of being spread out over many, is concentrated in increasingly fewer people, driving up their premiums even that much more, therefore more people drop. If we do nothing, the National Flood Insurance Program will collapse. This is important. The National Flood Insurance Program covers 4.7 American homes across the country. Now, clearly, I'm concerned about Louisiana. That's my state. But it's not just Louisiana or even just a coastal issue. Look at a map of those affected. Have been hit the hardest by flooding. They've all had at least $1 billion in claims from the National Flood Insurance Program. So Missouri, inland, has had over $1 billion in claim from the National Flood Insurance Program. My home state of Louisiana, but just go around and you can see California, Hawaii, all with this issue. Now, though, 44 states have had at least $50 million worth of claims, and those would be in the kind of mustard color. And so here you see, again, inland states, not coastal, inland, having problems with flooding. When we say a problem with flooding, we mean there is a family that has lost their possessions, they've lost their home, and now they don't know where to go. That's what we mean with a problem with flooding. My message to my colleagues representing states that rely on the National Flood Insurance Program is let's find a way forward. One day, the National Flood Insurance Program will lapse if we fail to act. Now, we are going to, in this CR, do a temporary extension. I would ask that we actually have a reauthorization and reform of the National Flood Insurance Program before it's too late. Now, by the way, a short-term extension, better than nothing. I thank the Speaker Johnson and the House for including a short-term extension, but if that's the only option, let's take that option. However, I'm working on a longer reauthorization so that National Flood Insurance Program is not thrown into a legal purgatory every year, or even sometimes multiple times a year. Today, I introduced a bill to fully reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program for this year and for next year. 4.7 million homeowners across the country deserve that little bit of certainty, and it does not seem like asking too much. Imagine if your homeowners or life insurance was subject to lapsing every year if Congress couldn't get their act together. Well, for families living in communities where the NFIP is the only option for flood insurance program, this would be unsettling. In less than 10 years, Congress has passed 32 short-term National Flood Insurance Program extensions. The vote we're taking tomorrow will be the 33rd short-term extension. American families holding their breath 33 times. Families need stability. Businesses need stability. This is the absence of stability. This is a yin and a yang. Congress needs to reauthorize this for an extended period of time. Let's make flood insurance affordable again. I will keep working to do that. I am pleased that the flood insurance program will survive the weekend, but we need to make it survive long term. Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following be entered separately into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, 74,000 people died of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs in 2023. Everyone in this chamber, everyone watching from home, knows of someone who has died of a fentanyl overdose. If you watch the Super Bowl, 74,000 is more people than were in the New Orleans Superdome. Now, they didn't just occur in a border state or in my state or your state. They occurred across the country. Every state is a border state when it comes to fentanyl flooding our country. Everyone feels the effect of the 50,000 pounds of fentanyl pouring across the open southern border or through the mail over the last couple of years. 50,000 pounds is enough to produce over 2 billion lethal doses, enough to kill everyone in the country 6 times over. I was just told by a friend about the DEA museum just outside of Washington, D.C. It has a new exhibit, The Faces of Fentanyl. You see walls covered with thousands of photographs of Americans, many of them young, who have died from an overdose. And when you see the pictures on these walls, you can't see them, but you know the presence of parents, brothers, sisters, friends, cousins, aunts, uncles, devastated when that person on the wall died. When they heard the news that their loved one had bought a pill online or from somebody that they happened to know, and perhaps they thought it was something else, perhaps they didn't know the potency, but nonetheless, when they took it, they died. The pain of this for so many people is why I urge my colleagues to join me in passing the Halt Fentanyl Act to enable law enforcement, to help law enforcement stop the criminals poisoning our fellow Americans. What does the Halt Fentanyl Act do? It makes permanent the Schedule I classification of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. What's a fentanyl analog? I'm a doctor, so I'm going to speak a little bit like a doctor. An analog is fentanyl, which is illegal, except they change it just enough so that when they change it, technically it would not be illegal. Yes, it looks like fentanyl, it addicts like fentanyl, it can kill like fentanyl, but because of a minor modification, it's not actually fentanyl. But it still has the same terrible, addictive, deadly effect of the actual thing. This still has the ability to take our loved ones from us. So, how do we stop that? We say that if it's either fentanyl or a fentanyl analog, that it is banned. And if you are illegally in possession of this, if you are selling it to other people, then law enforcement has a right to arrest you. And this bill makes this Schedule I classification, Schedule I meaning it's illegal to have, permanent. So aside from closing a loophole that criminals use to skirt around the law, we also strengthen the penalty for those who possess the fentanyl analog, and again, make it easier for law enforcement to prosecute. This isn't controversial. This is bipartisan. The need is there. We've been doing this on a temporary basis, but now we're going to make it permanent. Law enforcement will keep the most vital tool they have to hold fentanyl dealers accountable and to go after criminals. The bill also makes it easier to research fentanyl analogs to determine if they actually have a medical use. It's possible that one of these analogs is better than the real thing. And fentanyl does have, when prescribed by a physician appropriately, valid medical use. So maybe one of these analogs is useful. We allow research into that, while at the same time we are giving law enforcement the ability to prosecute if it's used for things such as creating addiction. President Trump has said he would sign this if we passed it. I am working to get this bill to his desk. I'd like to thank my colleague from Iowa, Senator Grassley, the Judiciary Committee Chairman, for moving this bill through his committee so quickly, and to the Majority Leader for bringing this bill up for a vote. I also want to thank my colleague from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, for his work on this issue. I also thank Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, who this has really cared about this issue, and Senator Heinrich has pushed this on a bipartisan basis. The longer we wait, the more it emboldens drug cartels, people in China who mail this through, who either send supplies to Mexico or mail the fentanyl itself through the mail, and other criminals who look to exploit our communities. We can take a concrete step in fighting the opioid crisis with the Halt Fentanyl Act. Republicans are united, This is a bipartisan bill. The country is united. Let's bring that 74,000 fentanyl death toll down to zero. I'll never yield in this fight, but for now, I do yield the floor.